Hi everyone, it's Marcy from Canadian Equality Consulting. And today I have a very special guest joining us for our coffee chat. I want to welcome Bety Tesfay. So thank you so
Hi, thanks for
much.
having me.
Thank you so much for joining today. And Bety is an Ethiopian Canadian JD and MPP student at the University of Calgary. And she's the VP of the Black Law Student Association. And a research assistant at the Policy School. And she's passionate about leveraging education and experience to advocate for justice. So just to jump into things, I recently heard Bety talk on an Instagram Live on Black Lives Matter for the Direct Her Network and was really impressed. So I thought I'd reach out to her immediately and ask her if she could share her thoughts and perspectives and wisdom with our audience as well. So as you've also seen in my social media posts and in our blog, Canadian Equality Consulting fully supports Black Lives Matter, and we're on our journey of being an anti-racist ally. So I wanted to start by asking Bety if you could share with us what the Black Lives Matter movement means to you, and then maybe you could also talk a little bit about how even now, the conversation on police brutality has really focused more on Black men.
Of course. So for the first part of the question, I think the Black Lives Matter movement for me is about justice. It's about marginalized people having the same, being treated the same or having the same opportunities. So for me, the Black Lives Matter movement is building on the work of the generations before, to move Canada into a society that it has anti-racist. So there's to end anti-Black racism, and especially within institutions, because I mean, obviously at the end of the day, people can feel how they feel, and that's one thing. But I think institutions should be designed for all, not just for certain people who look a certain way or make a certain amount of money. So that's one of the reasons, that's what the Black Lives Matter movement means to me. It's about focusing on what unique challenges Black people face in the States, but also here in Canada, when it comes to the effects of white supremacy and other issues that are alive within our Canadian institutions too. And then in terms of the focus on Black men, with regards to police brutality, I think Black women experience racism and sexism. So I think that's one part of it that sort of further marginalizes Black women, because I think Black men sort of benefit from one aspect of their identity, which is their men. And then I think in addition to that, there are also harmful stereotypes that exist about Black women. Black women are hypersexualized or seen as not credible, or they're too aggressive and maybe not worthy of protection or don't need that protection. And then I think there is that failure to do a more gender-based analysis when it comes to violence that occurs. And so what type of violence do Black women experience? So it's not just being killed by police, but what about sexual assault and that sort of violence? And I think it's also evidence of how, as Canadian society, we treat violence such as sexual assault, how it tends to be hidden under the rug and all that kind of stuff. So I think Black women just sort of, unfortunately, are marginalized by those two different identities. And I think that's why there is a focus on the effects of police brutality on Black men.
Interesting. Yeah, and in Canada and in Calgary even, we tend to think that we see what's happening in the US and we're like, oh, we're not that bad, right? Or they're more extreme down there. We have some problems, but not that many. But I'd love it if you could share some barriers that Black women do experience in Calgary.
Mm-hmm. So before I share the barriers, I want to say, like, I understand that desire. Like, we look down south and think, oh yeah, that's not us, thank God. Like, you know what I mean? So I understand that it comes, it's not just in this, in the Black Lives Matter movement. There is a little bit of Canadian pride tied to being not America. So I get that. But I think at the same time, here in Calgary, in Canada, there is a lack of representation. We don't see ourselves. We don't know about history of Black people. I think, I mean, I can't speak for the experiences of Black people who grew up here. I moved here 9 years ago, and I had to do a lot of reading and learning outside of school myself to learn about history of Black people here in Canada. I think sometimes, again, because of how big America is, we forget that we have the problem too, just because we're smaller. And so I think the feeling of not belonging in a world that normalizes whiteness or sets it out to be the standard is another barrier. So that can happen in maybe not as big things as being told, oh, you know, you don't sound Black, which sort of erases the diversity of Black people and our experiences. Like, we're not a monolith. And then I think in addition to that, there is also the intersections of other things, such as immigration status, socioeconomic status, language barriers, cultural barriers, and all these kind of things, like lack of the recognition of education obtained outside of Canada. So these things can be barriers for Black women in Calgary.
That's awesome. And I like it how you hit on a few different kind of types and forms of racism that Black women experience in Calgary, whether they be sort of individual ones that show up as microaggressions, or the larger systemic ones at play that kind of show that our system is broken. But what's interesting is I recently read this article from a friend I used to work with, and she said, you know, this doesn't shine a light showing that our system is broken or that our systems are broken. It shines a light on that they're working exactly as they were designed to, which is for white supremacy. And that's how they were designed originally. And, you know, that they're just completely wrong. They need to be completely redone and not just kind of patched or repaired.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. I agree with your friend.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when we talk about kind of intersectionality and the experience of Black women, and kind of the gender equality movement and the feminist movement has kind of traditionally been catered and focused on white women and has left out women of color. And a quick example is that, you know, what most people don't realize is that typical statistic for pay inequality that we all hear, kind of women earn 87 cents for every $1 a man earns, is really only the white woman's statistic. And for women of color, the wage gap is much bigger, and it's at 33%. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and how feminists can ensure the voices and experiences of women in color are not excluded.
Mm-hmm. And I think it starts with listening to our experience, recognize and acknowledge our identity as Black women, not just as women. So saying things like, oh yeah, we're sort of all in this together, and like, you know what I mean? If we don't call it out, and specifically say, okay, so this is how I experience going to work, or this is how people see me, or this is how institutions see me. And if we don't identify that that is different for white women as opposed to Black women and other women of color, then we won't really ever be fighting together. It would just always continue to be a white women movement. And I think stop silencing or gaslighting. So stop saying things like, oh yeah, why does everything have to be about race? So this is not fun, like for me, like for anyone really that I know, like, you know what I mean? We want to talk about other stuff, like with, so being Black is not the only aspect of my identity. There's so many different things, but when things continue to be about race, then you pretend, it's like when people say don't talk about racism, like, you know what I mean? So it's just like, as a woman, when you just pull everything together and just say, we're just going to, the feminist movement is for women, without really saying, okay, which women? Like, you know what I mean? And even me as a Black woman, but also a Black woman who's educated and who benefits from my socioeconomic status. My experiences are different from someone who, say, immigrated to Canada as a refugee, like a Black woman who immigrated to Canada as a refugee. I immigrated here with my family as an economic migrant. And then I think it's important, and this is just a suggestion, but like no diversity equity panels without women of color, at least, like Black women, but also at least women of color. Because again, when you don't have people who have those experiences, you miss out on having those conversations. And then you pat yourself on the back for having that conversation. So, and when you do try and stay away from tokenism, so I don't know if you've ever seen those pictures or like photos for companies or businesses where like literally 90% of people are white people, but all the photos you see are of like the 3 people of color in that organization. So again, I understand that because of how circumstances have been, white women have more access, more seat at the table. But then when there's a woman of color, when there's a Black woman, don't silence them, encourage them to speak. So I think those are all some of the ways that the feminist movement and white women can support and ensure that our voices are heard as well, our experiences are heard as well.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. I'd also love to ask you, what's your advice, or do you have any recommendations on how we can all become more actively anti-racist and better allies?
Mm-hmm.
And when I say we, I don't just mean me and like Canadian Quality Consulting or white people writ large, but like everyone, because everyone needs to become an ally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So I think you set specific goals for yourself. I think this works for just about everything, but sometimes you get caught up in the feelings and the emotions of being part of a movement and the anger that seeing certain things evoke because you're seeing it constantly and consistently on your timeline. But then sort of things change. It doesn't really become as much of a focus for you anymore. And I think that's when those metrics that you set or the accountability partner that you have sort of comes in. So it's not just like, oh yeah, I'm going to be anti-racist, throw in that goal and then nothing else to follow through. It's just like, so what are you going to do in order to be an anti-racist, in order to be a better ally? Are you going to hear about stories that stories that center someone else that does not look like you, sound like you, doesn't come from the same background as you do? And then are you going to be someone who makes people who make racial jokes or any other type of stuff like that uncomfortable? So basically, you're not a safe space for racists. You're going to just hold them accountable because that's what you do, like, I think. So, and I think that's helpful for Black people or other people who experience different types of racism, because sometimes it feels like you're the only one saying things. You just don't want to be another angry Black woman or too sensitive. So I think it's when you speak up as well, instead of like coming and telling me afterwards that you agree with what I said or whatever. It's just like, it helps to hear you say something. And I think especially when you have privilege, and that can be privilege that comes from your whiteness, or it can be privilege that comes from your the fact that you're straight or your socioeconomic status. It's just like, maybe certain people are more likely to listen to you. So it's like, what do you do with that privilege? And we all have privilege in certain areas of our lives, some people more so than others, but we all have the ability to sort of step in situations. So I think that would be another thing that I would recommend. And then talk to people, like the people in your community and your spheres of influence, and accept that it's not necessarily just posting things on Instagram. I think it's cool for those people who can start conversations on Instagram. I'm not one of those people, but if within your community, within the people that you know, if you can talk about that with your kids, your parents, whoever, your friends, and say, hey, so this is what this is, and be vulnerable. And then also just, I think the one thing, a final thing I'd like to say is, have a personal stake in this. Like, you're not doing this to help me. You're not doing this to help Black people. This is not charity work on your part. This is, I am personally invested in justice. I am personally invested in seeing Canadian society become one that is anti-racist. That's why I'm doing this. So I just want to say, please leave any savior complexes that you have at the door.
Awesome. I love that. Leave your savior complexes at the door. Yeah. That's incredible. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives and your expertise with us, and motivating and kind of inspiring us to become better, more active allies for sure. And thank you so much. And I'm really excited to see what you do next, and where you decide to go after you finish your 2 degrees. So,
thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.